Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sincere Noble Final Conference. My name is Jo O'Hara. I will be your host for today and looking forward to a really good couple of days here looking at the outputs of these two programs. So, like I say, we've got 2 days. I'm with you for the half of today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the former head of the Forest Service in Scotland, Scotland's Chief Forester, and I'm currently a consultant, and I'm doing work, for example, with the Irish government on forest policy. So that's enough about me. Just the sort of outline for the day and how it's going to work. We're going to have 3 sessions of presentations, and then we've got a panel session at the end. There will be an opportunity for audience participation to try and keep this lively. So there will be Q&A sessions at the end of each section. If you have any questions that you want to submit, please put them into the Q&A using the Q&A function. What we will do is we'll try to get as many of you as we can on camera to ask your question. If you are selected for that, the team who are like swans in the background scurrying around, we'll let you know, and we'll put the camera on for you to ask your question. So please type into the Q&A what your question is, and if you can, who it's for, and also the name that you want to be addressed by, because it doesn't always come across on Zoom. Okay, thank you for that. We're also, towards the end of the conference, going to have a bit of audience participation with some polls using Mentimeter. I'll tell you a bit more about those later on, so hopefully stick around for those after coffee. We've got over 200 people registered today, and I see we already have over 60 people online, so it's a good crowd of people there in the audience. And like I say, do feel free to engage and participate through those methods. The final point I'd like to say is to make an apology for those of you who are expecting to hear from Michael Jenkins, the President and CEO of Forest Trends, here today. Unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, Michael's been unable to join us, so we won't be getting a keynote from him, or he won't be able to join the panel. We only got that news at very short notice. So sadly, we won't have Michael with us, but we have got a lot of really good speakers, so I'm really looking forward to hearing this today. And to kick us all off with this, I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Mavsar, the Deputy Director of EFI, to open the conference and welcome you all here. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Jo. Dear colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to participate in today's conference on incentives for ecosystem services in Europe to connect the science, practice and policy, which is jointly organized by the Sincere and the Nobel projects. So as Jo already introduced me, my name is Robert Mavsar and I'm working at the European Forest Institute as the Deputy Director. However, before converting myself into a boring gray administrator, my field of research was actually on the economic valuation of ecosystem services. It feels like quite a while ago that I was doing this. And at the time when I started, I will not say how many years ago, but it was still considered as a rather minor one that was widely believed to be just an ecosystem services, just a pleasant side effect from forest, but anything that had really to do with value was connected to wood. Even some 10 years ago, we were coordinating a study for the DG Agriculture on the development and marketing of non-marketed forest products and services. And still at that time, it was like more of a dipping into the topic for the Commission and a little bit starting to move in this direction. And already we just compared the previous year for a strategy with the new one that was adopted just this summer. It shows an increasing importance of the topic just by comparing how many times ecosystem services are mentioned in the 2 documents. And the later one, so the very recent one, has at least 3 times more of these words in the text. So in this context, it is important to improve our knowledge on ecosystem services, their characteristics, how we can manage them, and what the relations are between these services. And of course, also on the other side, to understand what is the public or specific stakeholders' opinions, perceptions, preferences and needs in this respect. Also, the political debate is slowly following in the direction where it's recognized that the ecosystem services is becoming of a growing importance, and that the role of different actors are playing in their provision. Nonetheless, the latest forest strategy that I already mentioned before is seeking to develop, among other things, of course, financial incentives, in particular for private forest owners and managers, for the provision of these ecosystem services. And also the current public debate shows quite a big difference between different groups of the public that are defending more provisioning on one or the other ecosystem service. So in all these, we can see that the debate is moving in this direction. However, whenever the debate starts and the political tension starts to turn its interest to something, they normally look for quick fixes, universal instant solutions. However, unfortunately, in the case of ecosystem services and the payments for their provision, this might not be always possible or the easiest. So therefore, this furthermore underlines the importance of continued creation of knowledge, of doing research, of opening new questions, but also to engage in a dialogue with different actors that should be around the same table, discussing and to create a broader understanding of the challenges and opportunities that ecosystem services and their provision are offering. So in this respect, I believe that this conference today, and not only the conference, but also the projects, are very, very timely and important. And I hope that this is just one of the first steps in creating a broader understanding and dialogue in the EU and beyond. So thank you very much, and I wish you a successful event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. That's fascinating. I love that forest ecosystem services is a pleasant side effect in the past. Yes, it's a long time since I've heard people talking about forest ecosystem services as externalities, which is what it used to be in my day, but I think a pleasant side effect captures it nicely. So great, thank you. That sets us up really nicely. So introducing now the two projects, Sincere and Noble, we're going to hear from Georg Winkel, head of the Bonn office and head of the governance program at EFI, and then from Harald Wadczyk, who's the associate professor at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. So Georg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Just checking, can you see the presentation?
Yes, that's showing well here. It's still in, it's not in presentation mode at the moment.
Okay, yeah, this is always not so funny. Let's see, oops, what is this? Got it. Let me see how I can change this. Give me a second. We are so good in time that I can still give it a try. Let me try again. Let's try this here.
We could see your slides the last time, but it wasn't in presentation mode. Maybe
yes, exactly. Actually, I should be able to change this, but okay, I don't.
That's it. Oh no, it's still in presentation.
It's still the same thing. Well, I hope you can still see it because I don't want to steal too much of your time, and you can hear me. I will try to fix it for my second presentation in the afternoon. Welcome warmly also on my behalf, on behalf of the Sincere project, to our final conference. It's a big pleasure to see many familiar names in the list of participants, and we really very much look forward towards this conference. My job is just to give you a hopefully not totally boring presentation about what the Sincere project is doing. Sincere is spurring innovations for forest ecosystem services in Europe. It's a project funded by Horizon 2020 for 4 years. We are now in the final year where it gets really interesting, where different results, findings, and also practical experiences come together. And that is part of that. We really would like to present it, to discuss with all of you in this conference. This is an overview on the partners. I'm not going to read now all the sincere partners. We have 22, I believe. But what I would like to highlight is that we have a nice mixture in the project of really practical partners, forest owner associations, IUCN, business-related organizations, ISTO4, and partners on the ground that really deal with very practical forest management issues. I come back later to the importance of that aspect. And at the same time, we have, I think, leading academic research institutions on the topic within Europe, like universities and research institutes, but also a bit beyond Europe. I again come back to this in the last part of my presentation. So it's a nice mixture of partners, and this is also, I think, very much at the key of Sincere project, that we do not only work on research and generating new findings, but a lot of our work in the last years has been on the ground, has been trying to advance innovation actions, as we like to call them, on forest ecosystem services, which has not been easy, partly, especially in the times of the pandemic, where a lot of the multi-actor engagement has been hampered also by distancing rules and similar issues. What is Sincere about? Well, it starts from the challenge that, as we all know, and as we will hear later this afternoon, people's demands and expectations towards forests, they are dynamic and they're also evolving. And there are synergies and trade-offs between the provision, basically ecosystem services understood as a response to societal demands. If forest managers and owners try to deal with providing them, there are synergies and trade-offs also compared, if you look at a bit closer into those ecosystem services that they can provide on a market and those that are demanded for society. And there are different responses, as we will also see later today, of how forest managers and owners respond to changing societal demand, and also the interplay of market forces and other expectations, and of course institutions and rules. And I mean, it has been mentioned also by the opening notes by Robert Nassar. We live in a time where we have, that was before, a complex, but also quite rapidly evolving and changing European policy framework, where indeed forest ecosystem services and the idea that forests provide many of them and diverse of them has become very critical and important in the debate recently. In Sincere, we see this, or we saw this, and still see this as a starting point for innovations, so for new ideas, for new mechanisms, governance arrangement, but also business models to provide ecosystem services. We are doing this in several work packages connected to objectives. First, in what is work package 1 in Sincere, we try to really do a stack-taking exercise to analyze the conditions of innovations for forest ecosystem service across Europe. We used refuse, a catalog of innovative mechanisms. Where do these innovations really take place? How do they look like? But also we did a large-scale survey with landowners, forest owners, and forest managers across the EU to look into how do they perceive societal demand, how do they work with ecosystem services innovations. We will come back to that. Secondly, we engaged in what we called a learning architecture in the project, where we try to really intensively engage between forest management practitioners, researchers, and also policy actors, following a multi-actor approach, and also had some interesting workshops, 2 of them quickly to mention. One was looking into the importance of spiritual forest ecosystem services. That's perhaps something where you would not think immediately about when you think about forests and their services they provide. And the other one looking into the special challenges that small-scale private forest owners have when they want to participate in innovations relating to ecosystem services. We had then 11 innovation action cases. That will be my last slide. I'm going to present after this slide, that were at the very key of the project and also show a bit the diversity of this topic, forest ecosystem services across Europe and beyond. And now we are in the Sincere project in this stage of synthesizing the knowledge that we gained on one hand in this practical on-the-ground innovation actions, and on the other hand on the research side of the project. And this conference, together with the Nobel project, is a key undertaking in that regard. We hope to find ideas for transferable innovative mechanisms. We will hear speeches on that. But also we hope that we can support the currently dynamically evolving European policy framework on ecosystem services. So we have ideas and contributions from the project, and we will today also hear presentations that have that orientation. And finally, of course, we are quite heavily engaged in communication and dissemination activities throughout the project. Now, my last slide is to give you a quick overview on what is, as I said, at the core of the Sincere project. It is our 11 innovation actions. You see, I will just say a word to every action, starting on the left side, at least on my screen, probably on yours it's different, I don't know this now for sure. We have a case of funeral forests, a really quite innovative and new and booming business model where cultural or spiritual forest ecosystem services are central in Switzerland. It's about transforming a forest into a kind of graveyard, but connected still to it remaining a forest, with a lot of interesting arrangements to be taken, a lot of possibilities for landowners to diversify their income, but also a very new type of forest management that is needed for such forested graveyards, so to say. Forests for Water is in the center of the innovation action on one hand in Spain, and on the other hand, on the upper side, the watershed services are also central for one of our 2 outside Europe cases, watershed services in Peru, where C4 is engaged. Then we have 2 innovation actions where biodiversity auctions are central, reverse auctions. One is in Denmark, where really the idea is that private forest owners bid for a state that is demanding from them biodiversity conservation, a really innovative tool. And I guess we have a presentation on that later as well. And a similar case in Belgium where a similar mechanism has been developed and tested with this idea that that would lead to more efficient forest ecosystem services provision through an auctioning process. We then have 2 Italian cases. One is where a forest is mainly designated to mushroom provision as a forest ecosystem services. And this case has been working on modernizing this provisioning service of the forest through an online platform, through a new tool that brings the clients, in this case really the citizens looking for mushrooms, together with the forest owners. And a second case where the idea is in intensively managed popular plantations to increase biodiversity on the ground with the help of certification and a special sustainability scheme. We then have a case, nature-based tourism in Finland, where the idea is in an intensively managed forest region that is also characterized by a normally, if it's not a pandemic, booming nature-based tourism to bring together the tourism players as well as the forest owners to agree on more tourism-friendly forest management measures close to nature forestry in a Nordic setting. Finally, or not finally, we have a case in Spain, in the Basque country, where the idea was initially to establish a new legislation for multiple forest ecosystem services. The idea has been a bit challenged throughout the multi-actor process towards more the idea of also providing support for forest owners that want to orient their forest management in the future more towards multiple ecosystem services. There's another case in Croatia where the idea is really to work with a nature park, exploring the importance of recreational ecosystem services as well as the health function of forests. And finally, I hope I haven't forgotten any case now because I used a completely different order than what I was planning to do. We have a really interesting case, a Russian case, where the idea was that the researchers together with stakeholders would work on an idea for a new federal forest law on multiple forest ecosystem services that would help to come in the Russian circumstances of how forest management is organized to a new multiple forest ecosystem oriented management approach. We have been joking in the consortium that if this works out, we will have the biggest impact that ever a project had in the EU context if you look at the simple sheer size of the Russian forest area. I hope I haven't forgotten any innovation actions. Please otherwise send me a note and I will introduce you later in my second presentation later this afternoon. If you want to know more, please visit our website or just stay on and follow the conference. You will have several presentations of Sincere. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Georg. I think you possibly missed Peru, but maybe come on to that one later. Okay, and now the sister project, the Nobel project, I'll hand over to you, Harold. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity also to present now the Nobel project. It's really nice that we can do this as a joint effort with the Sincere project. In our context, the sister project, Nobel, is funded under the Aeronet co-fund. This is innovating the forest-based bioeconomy, and the funding is received from the European Union and also from national funding organizations in the different partner countries in Austria, France, Germany, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Norway. The Nobel project is focusing on the one hand, the methodologies for assessing the economic, social, and environmental values of forest products and services at different levels. We are interested to evaluate business models and the mechanisms to internalize this socioeconomic value of non-marketed forest ecosystem services. And we would like then to combine these business models with public policy instruments for supporting the implementation of payment for ecosystem services schemes. And especially, we're also interested to deduct these trade-offs among different ecosystem services in pilot demonstrations. So we have also similar, like the Sincere project, a set of pilot demonstrations of case studies where we explore then this combination of different business models in the various contexts. And one maybe innovative mechanisms that we also plan to implement is to compare these different and alternative payment for ecosystem services schemes, including a web-based auction platform. Within the Nobel project, we are still in the context of the project. We have still 1 year to go. So for us, we are really happy to work and have already some findings, but many of the activities are still ongoing. So that's why I briefly give you maybe an idea about the overall approach within the Nobel project. So as I said, we focus on these pilot demonstrations. So where we are interested to see these different mechanisms, how payment for ecosystem services schemes could be implemented through direct payments, through voluntary payments, also through auctioning platforms or for taxes and subsidies. And thinking about these different mechanisms in different contexts, there's also the opportunity for the forest owners to provide these forest ecosystem services. And what we do is that we identify these business relations in a series of workshops together with all the different partners in our pilot demonstrations. And we discuss and develop then innovative forest management plans, how the provision of these ecosystem services could be improved, or how different forest ecosystem services could be implemented in parallel in order to minimize the trade-offs between different services. We predict then the effect of implementing these management actions with ecosystem models, and we are then interested in the quantification of these forest ecosystem services by indicators. We assess the economic value of them and quantify then these trade-offs with various multi-criteria decision-making tools and optimization tools. And finally, we support then this implementation of these mechanisms by different mechanisms. And one example is this web-based auctioning mechanism. Where we have our pilot demonstrations, they are spread all over Europe, ranging from Portugal to Sweden, also in Spain, Austria, and France. And all these different case studies are focusing on a particularly business model. So the way of how buyers and sellers are brought together. And they also have a different focus on the forest ecosystem services that are considered as being relevant. And this offers then also the opportunity for different implementations and different mechanisms in the various settings. As an overview about the activities within the Nobel project. This is an activity that we did jointly also with our partners in Sincere, where we are interested in the analysis of case studies. So similar, as Georg was mentioning, learning about the successful implementation for payment ecosystem services, we have to work together on different case studies and try to identify the key characteristics of the success of payment ecosystem services schemes. For those who would like to learn more about that, I do a small advertisement already on session 3, these business models for forced ecosystem services. Yeah, you will have an own talk and you will learn about this example. We have also worked on the development of the forced ecosystem service indicators. So according to the CISIS classifications, we developed 71 indicators which emerged from the discussions in different pilot demonstrations. So how different ecosystem services can be quantified, how they can be assessed, and how they can be utilized in later on also in the prediction and in the mapping of forest ecosystem services. The mapping is also an important aspect within the NOBEL project. Here, the colleagues of Norway are very much focusing on the geolocated forest ecosystem services indicators. So there's an interest to use remote sensing information and using this remote sensing information in order to categorize and map the provision of forest ecosystem services. So for different pilot demonstrations, there's the idea to map the provision of the services according to different indicators. And as I said, the prediction of ecosystem services is very important, and see what are the management effects. So for that purpose, we have a set of forest ecosystem models that we're using in the NOBEL project in order to predict these treatment effects on various forest ecosystems. So all the models that we're using within NOBEL are able to predict these ecosystem services under climate change. So they are sensitive according also to disturbances and climate change effects, and are able then to show how the provision of forest ecosystem services can change over time depending on the treatment effects. And maybe as a last point in that context, I also said that we are exploring a web-based auctioning platform for seeing the opportunities how buyers and sellers can be brought together in different mechanisms. So the idea is that an interesting consumer could select a certain land campaign through this web platform based on his preferences or her preferences, what is relevant for her, what kind of service, what kind of products, what are his interests. The interested consumer can also compare these various plans and raise then a bid on a certain plan. So he can check, or she can check the status of the different campaigns. There is also the opportunity to get in contact with other bidders, convince them maybe to bid on a certain plan, to make them aware about the profits and benefits of the different services. And then finally, the winning plan, who has, when the bidding closes, who has the highest bids, will then be able to be implemented. So there, as a consequence for the implementation, there will be then the importance to have a binding contract and also a third-party monitoring. So that's the overall idea and the approach of this auctioning platform in implementing the pilot demonstrations. And for those who would like to learn more, again, another advertisement for session 2. There will be the practitioner's view on forest ecosystem services, very interesting talk on the auctions and discussions. As Georg said, our sister project in Sincere, they have also reverse auctions as one of these mechanisms in place. So I think this is quite an interesting setting also to compare these different mechanisms in session 2 tomorrow. And finally, the list of partners that are working in the NOBEL project jointly together. And if you'd like to learn more about the project, please check out the Nobel Boku website. Thanks for your interest.
Thanks very much, Georg and Harold. That's a really useful overview of what the two projects are aiming to do, and brilliant stuff, just so relevant at the moment. And also good to see the span of the partnerships, geographically, how far that's all going. So loads of good stuff that set us up really well. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to move into the first session, which is a kind of overview of forest ecosystem services in Europe. And the first person I would like to welcome to present is Marko Lovrich, who is a senior researcher at the European Forest Institute. So Marko, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you see my screen?
Yes. No, not at the moment.
Now?
Yeah. Yes, it's there now.
All right. Well, hello everyone. Once again, my name is Marko Lovrich. I work in the European Forest Institute, and I come with a presentation: forest owners and ecosystem services across Europe. What I'm about to show basically focuses on mapping of forest ecosystem services, and it's done in cooperation with a big list of co-authors, which are listed here in the bottom, and together with InnoForest project. So, mapping of forest ecosystem services. Well, a lot has already been done on these topics, especially within the MICE initiative and as endorsed by the current and previous biodiversity strategy. But it's difficult to map them all, especially some like cultural ecosystem services. It's difficult to compare one against another because it's done on different scales and in different methods. And also there's a lack of information on income and profitability related to their supply. And also there's a lack of information on their innovations. So we posed quite a broad question: how are these forest ecosystem services distributed across Europe? And by forest ecosystem services, well, we listed some descriptors, mostly their supply and demand, income change and profitability, and the occurrence of innovations. And now you will see what do we actually mean more in depth by these dependent variables. So individual forest ecosystem services that we looked at are biomass for material use, for energy use, hunting, wild forest products, watershed protection, air quality regulation, climate change mitigation, habitats for plants and animals, cultural, emotional, and spiritual values, education, healthcare, sports, outdoor recreation. And all of these can be grouped into three: provisioning, regulating, and cultural. For these three groups of ecosystem services, we were interested in income change, and profitability. And the first group, we also wanted to see are there some innovations being developed, and we grouped together regulating and cultural ones. So if all of these are dependent variables, well, you can see that there's a lot of them. And we asked through a survey forest owners and managers about these variables. So a more honest research question would be, what's the perception of forest owners and managers on ecosystem services? We did so in two surveys. One was top-down survey distributed for different umbrella organizations representing different types of forest ownership, which was mentioned by Georg that this job was done in work package 1. But there's also another survey in Clearinghouse, project focused on urban forests, but they also had a section, do you own or manage a forest? And if yes, then we asked them about all of these questions. And the questions were posed in relation to a specific forest, like, can you describe this forest? Yes. Can you point it on a map? Yes. If they pointed on a map, they were included in the sample. And the sample size varies across different analyses and which dependent variable we were looking at, but let's say between 500 and 2,500 were the sample sizes. But obviously, if you have 1,000 points in the forest, it doesn't truly represent the European diversity, especially if it's not proportionally geographically distributed. So we wanted to make it representative of Europe, where the assumption is that how the forest looks like tells us what these dependent variables are. So if a country has a certain growing stock, if a forest has a certain growing stock, tree species composition, if it's protected or not, it will have a certain level of supply of certain forest ecosystem service and also a certain level of profitability. So this is the assumption behind the analysis. And what we actually did, so we combined this survey data with point locations with all the spatial explicit data on Europe's forest that we could master on 1 by 1 kilometer spatial resolution. We combined the two in this Google's machine learning approach called TensorFlow. And then we re-estimated the survey data, so from 1,000 points or 2,000 points to 1.5 million points, representing most of Europe. These are some estimates of how good this procedure was. So we could, with a certain validity, say that there's a low, medium, and high level of supply or demand in certain point location, and we're about 90–95% sure that some innovation type could happen in a certain forest. And there's a list of all these spatial explicit data. It's basically the things that you would think of. So tree species composition, Natura 2000 sites, distance to a city, carbon, biomass, the typical stuff. There's a lot of variables, in total around 100. And we also didn't estimate the Russia, but for all the other parts of Europe we did. And based on this, we did some basic statistical analysis to show how these variables are distributed across Europe, and then compare it against one another, or compare the dependent against the independent variables. And now some results. This shows the supply and demand for non-wood forest products in the form of histogram bundled up for entire Europe. Here, the red vertical plot means the middle point of the distribution, and you can see that the demand is higher than the supply. Usually that's not the case. So in almost all of the other cases, if you bundle it all up on European level, the supply and demand are matched. But in this example, they are not. An example of a matched supply and demand is if you bundle the cultural ecosystem services up, and you can see, well, these distributions are actually quite like one another. But the demand is actually a little bit bimodal, and you can see in the red eclipse, you can see that there are some forests that have a lot of demand for cultural ecosystem services. And it will be interesting to see which kind of forests these are and where are they located. Next, we mapped the supply and demand for basically outdoor recreation. Well, it's quite small, the pictures, but they basically look alike. So they're very similar, and they are on equal scales. What is also visible here is that there are pronounced country level differences in perception of the supply and demand. For instance, in Germany and Finland, they say they have a lot of supply and demand across almost all the ecosystem services. But in some other countries, for instance, in the entire Southeastern Europe, they have lower estimates. And this kind of bias can be taken out if you do demand minus supply, and now the picture looks different. So there is more need for health, sports, and outdoor recreation in the North and South Europe, where in the Central Europe, there's enough of it. So although the absolute levels of these demands and supply differ, in relative terms, there's more need of it in the North and in the South. And we can do the same type of estimate for all the 11 ecosystem services. Next, when we do the same demand minus supply for all the bundled regulating ecosystem services, here you can see it goes from negative green to positive red, that there's more need for regulating ecosystem services in the North, East, and South Europe, not so much in Germany and France, but this also indicates that the surveys has been done some time ago. Now, if you do them now after the floods in Germany, I guess the situation would look different. Then we kind of grouped all the forests based on their supply and demand of ecosystem services. And you can see the blue ones and the red ones. So the red ones, the cluster 2, is Finland, Germany, some Poland, and France, and northeastern Spain, and the blue is the rest. So these kind of areas have similar patterns of supply and demand. If you compare it in individual variables, well, you can see that those marked in red have more supply and more demand of all ecosystem services. And this is like the main result. You have to look at the other rows, but this is the main finding. And to some extent, it can be answered with these differences in national perceptions of what supply and demand actually mean. Next, if you look at income from different groups of ecosystem services bundled up for entire Europe, you can see, well, that about 80% of income, of forest income, comes from provisioning ecosystem services, meaning from wood. And the 20 remaining percent is about equally distributed between regulating and cultural ecosystem services. So not all money comes from wood. There is some of it coming from regulating and cultural ecosystem services. But perhaps the country level distributions are more interesting. Here you can see that change in profitability in supplying provisioning ecosystem services in the last 20 years. And the profitability increases from southwest to northeast. So it's most profitable in Finland. Again, this is not a surprising finding. What is perhaps more surprising is the income change in regulating ecosystem services, that in relative terms, there's more of it coming in Eastern Europe. And this is perhaps something that requires further inquiry in why this is so. And this is perhaps the most interesting finding of the presentation, that we again clustered all the forests based on their income and profitability. And there we found two groups of forests, one in the north and east of Europe, which truly focus on provisioning ecosystem services for their financing. And in the west and south Europe, some money comes from regulating and cultural ecosystem services. So if you compare it to the previous graph, although there's a relative change in the increase of money coming from cultural and regulating ecosystem services, on absolute level, it's still low. And you can also see that cluster one is much bigger. So that in majority of Europe's forests, all the money comes from basically wood. Then distribution of probability of wood innovation occurrence. Well, there's more of it in the west than in the east. And the same goes for all the other innovation types. There's a higher probability of them happening in the Western Europe than in the Eastern Europe. And if we bundle it all up, well, we can say the supply and demand for individual ecosystem services are usually matched on the European level, but there are much bigger differences in the regions of Europe or individual countries. We can also say that majority of income comes from wood, which is not surprising, but we still have the 20% remaining coming from regulating cultural ecosystem services. And these income distributions, well, they are not equal across Europe. There's also a high probability of innovations in the West than in the East. And this middle part perhaps is the most important finding that we can say, is there a truly multiple streams of financing of forestry? For 2/3 of Europe's forest, there isn't. So this is perhaps the biggest policy implementation of this analysis. We also have to emphasize on what did we actually present. So we presented forest owners and managers' perceptions of some descriptors of forest ecosystem services, and they are not all equally reliable. So the questions on the supply and demand, they are complicated. But questions like, did you make some money or did you do something innovative, are not. So these kind of estimations are more reliable than the supply and demand. And also, we didn't explain the entire picture. So are there some other possible explanations? Yes, for sure. Some could be legislation or distribution of annual allowable cut, differences in perceptions, institutional frameworks. So there are a lot of missing variables here. And what to do next? Well, we can compare it to other mapping exercises. And we have to perhaps focus on what we can truly say with a certain level of confidence. And this is this financing issue. And also to reassess and further analyze the data, because it's a mountain of it, and this is still a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. That's fascinating. And this challenge, particularly for policymakers and economics, of how things vary in space across Europe, is that's really kind of useful feed into that whole discussion. I just want to remind everybody, please remember to do some Q&A. I think we've only got one so far. So if you could put your Q&A into the Q&A box, and I'll come to you at the end, whether that's for Georg or Harold or Marco or Gerhard, who's just about to speak. So please get those questions lined up so we can have a good Q&A session after we have heard from Gerhard. So I'm handing over to you now, Gerhard Weiss, who's the head of office at the European Forest Institute at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. And Gerhard is going to talk about innovations for forest ecosystem services across Europe. So Gerhard, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Can you see my screen and is it running?
Yes, that's very clear.
Okay, very good. So that was very interesting to hear the results from Marco with this quantitative approach that they used. And I'm using here in my presentation a qualitative approach, which probably I would say it would need some more close look how those match, but that would be an interesting discussion. But okay, so my presentation is on innovations in forest ecosystem services across Europe. And in my case, as I said, qualitative, I'm more basing my results on qualitative work. That means case studies that we have researched in various projects, recent projects. So I work in the Nobel project ongoing, but I have been working in other European projects before, and those are the basis of this presentation. Now it doesn't. Let's see. Okay, how does it go to the next slide? Aha, good. So my presentation, I will start with some general considerations about innovation and forest ecosystem services. I will then focus especially on non-timber forest ecosystem services and give and present innovative approaches for how to market such services and have some conclusions. So as a background, I want to make you aware that these forest ecosystem services they are quite diverse, and we have quite different products or goods and services ranging from timber to all kinds of non-timber goods or services. And they do have very different economic characteristics, and there are different institutional frameworks in place around those, and that results in quite different innovation patterns. Very generally, we can say when we look at timber, especially larger forest holdings, they are innovative. So that comes from our studies, but not so much the smaller companies that don't focus so much on forest, but they have other like agricultural activities on the side. And when we then look at non-timber forest ecosystem services, we see that these are often not seen as a business opportunity. So they are more produced in the wake of timber production, we could say, and there is not an innovation focus on those in many companies and also in the innovation systems. Now I want to look at economic, institutional, and social characteristics or aspects. So when we look at products such as timber, mushrooms, landscape amenities, or recreation, then we see that they have quite different economic characteristics. So probably most of you know this concept of public and private goods. So which has implications for the marketability of those products. So timber, for example, is more a pure private good and easily to market, but many other goods and services are not. So summarizing that means that there is for many services, goods or services, limited marketability, which is due to natural attributes which cannot be changed, and partly also institutional attributes. So there may be, we could mention 2 different strategies for making them marketable. One would be transformation, that would be on the institutional level, institutional properties such as legal status, and an example here is carbon, the creation of carbon markets. And the other is product development, which happens just simply within companies when they are in innovative ways developing new marketing approaches or creating goods. And we have seen already today examples presented by Georg, for example, and we will learn about some later today and also in my presentation. With regard to institutional frameworks, that's important for innovations because of different roles. So institutions, they have direct roles such as advisory services or providing funds, and they have important indirect roles in research, in education and training, or with regard to the regulatory systems. And again, when we especially look at non-timber forest ecosystem services, we see that institutional frameworks very often neglect those. So there is a lack of attention because the forestry policies or forestry innovation systems and actors, they don't focus on those, but also agricultural actors do not focus on those. So there is generally an important lack of support from the institutional system. But when we want to diffuse those innovations or scale up those innovations, institutional structures are needed, and that happens, for example, with specific associations such as chestnut associations or mushroom associations or similar, so around these products. Now, social aspects, that's important because when we look at those, what are often called non-market goods or services, there is a growing demand because there are fundamental social changes connected with those, because things that were subsistence needs before are now good markets because they are connected to urban demands, such as when customers look for their natural quality or retro traditional qualities or experiential qualities of forest goods or services. And so here are strong opportunities, and I'm summarizing those factors, challenges, and opportunities here quickly. So one factor is that there is a limited marketability of many of those forest ecosystem services, which only, we have to be realistic, they can be overcome only to a certain extent. Then second, a challenge is the limited attention of the current innovation systems and policies. And third, that's the opportunity, growing demand when we connect these rural resources with urban demands. And now I come to innovative approaches for marketing. So I give examples for those: market creation, territorial marketing, add-on services, voluntary payments, or social innovations, or experience economy. So starting with the first, market creation, one example is this payments for ecosystem services approach. There will be more said about that by Ben Wunder today. So that is proposed and discussed a lot, but in my view, the possibilities are limited because in the narrow sense, creating markets is quite difficult and limited, and also in practice, so far there have not been so many examples in the strict sense of these payments when it's not just subsidies. Then territorial marketing, which also goes under regional marketing, that is an approach where the territorial quality or the regional quality of a product, of a forest product, is used in the marketing, and then that can work with various labels, regional labels, for example. So in different ways. So when labels are specifically used, such as the PGI label, but also without a specific label, but on local markets, farmers markets, Christmas markets, there is also this quality, regional, geographical quality of the product in the product, which gives them a specific market opportunities. Another type or approach is add-on services. So services that are specifically offered for the market for activities such as guided tours or restaurants. And so here income can be generated for, let's say, for example, for the landscape amenity, even though there is a free access to the forest, but with the specific offers, recreational, touristic offers, or other cultural services, income can be generated. Another approach is voluntary payments. So there is a possibility to market for the qualities of forest ecosystem services where people voluntarily pay, and that works through certifications, gifts, donations, or eco-sponsoring. There are various approaches how those payments can be utilized in marketing. And again, a different approaches would be social innovations that are oriented at the common good or the community. There are also many different, various kinds of examples. So green care is an example, or activities for vulnerable groups. Another is rural development. So this example here, a chestnut region in Italy, that's also connected to this regional quality that I mentioned before, or regional marketing. But here the social innovation aspect is that there is a joint effort to developing that in the region. And again, another example is social participation. So here, so here with the social participation, interest in the forest and then also in forest products is generated. So finally, the last example is experience economy. And here the specific approach is that forest products can be marketed in the connection with experiential services, and that can work in different ways. So the simplest would be the offer of services such as workshops or guided tours, where the people have the direct experience in the forest, but that approach also works with, for example, a jar of jam from forest products, forest berries. They are marketed with a premium price if people have spent time there, and then they pay for this, for the memory. But it even works when people not even have been there, but just buy this regional product, and the experience is in the mental image connected with a nature park or national park or something. I'm coming to my conclusions, so which is mostly a summary. So what I have said is that there are strong limitations for the marketing of many forest goods and services, and there is lacking support from the institutional or policy level. But there are manifold approaches, examples, and opportunities, and they are growing in my view. And if we want to utilize them for the scaling up or diffusion, we need institutional innovations or creating institutions such as markets or associations that I have mentioned some examples. And policy support is needed, and that should follow the most promising approach is to follow systemic policies that combine information and coordination and financing and regulations in or combinations of those. And there should also be a connection of top-down and bottom-up approaches. So the policy is top-down, but it needs to hook on bottom-up resources and initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. Fascinating. I was just completely caught up in all of that in terms of these ways of creating markets, because we've been trying to do it for years. And just those different ways that you can get that value realized from the forest was really interesting. Okay, so we're into the Q&A session now. So I wonder, could we get the screens of Georg, Harold, Marco and Gerhard, or if you could all turn your cameras on and you'll go live. And we've got a few questions that have come in. I'm going to ask the first one on behalf of the person, just while we do some tech in the background. So this was a question that comes from Taslima van Scheidt, I think the name is, to Marco. I see, Harold, you've already answered it from the point of view of Nobel, but this was specifically put to Marco, which is, in your work, Marco, were there any projects on the financialization of forest carbon?
No, that was not the focus of Sincere. Perhaps Georg has a better overview of other projects, or someone else in the group.
Or maybe, Harold, do you want to build on what you put back in the chat in the Q&A session?
Yeah, I just wanted to stress the point that the colleagues at INRE, they have worked together with the Metropole Grant and NACI in cooperation. And the special focus is that they want to develop a web platform that can be used then by different forest owners in France in order to allow this carbon trading. So they have really the idea through afforestation or for reforestation or any kind of management activities that they increase the carbon stock. And there are now several projects, so local projects on a local level, which have been developed. And the idea is now to bring the buyers and sellers together through such a platform. I mean, the details could then be brought maybe by our colleagues in France, but that's why I sent the web link. So for those who are interested, they can have a look on that.
That's great. Thanks very much, Harold. Does anybody else want to come in on that, or shall we move to the next question? Okay, next question is from Valentino Marini Govigli, I think. Govigli, yes, hopefully I've got your name right. Valentino, you have a question for the panel.
Yes, hi everyone, and thanks for being able for asking this question. My question is to Marco. Thank you, first of all, for your presentation. It was really interesting. But I would like to have, if possible, a little bit more of information on this, on the cultural ecosystem service part of your study. So specifically on these emotional and spiritual values that you have assessed, because it seems to me that a lot of critics against the ecosystem service assessment tool is that they often fail to quantify in a proper way these services because they are more intangible, and you used a very quantitative approach to assessing ecosystem service value. So I would like to know a little bit more detail on how this is done, because in my view, they often change accordingly to the users rather than the forest owners, and the different perception that users assign to forest or natural features, and the different emotion they perceive when the users go across forested areas or natural settings and landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is an excellent question, but it goes beyond what was presented here. But we were involved in some other surveys and papers that I can comment on this. So there's another survey that we did in cooperation with the European Landowner Association, focusing on cultural ecosystem services. It was led by our colleague Mario Toralba. And we looked just in cultural ecosystem services in that. And usually we could say that they go hand in hand. So there is no big trade-offs in their provision. This was like a wider survey focusing on those. In here, this was just forest owners and managers, so it doesn't represent society. More societal perceptions can be seen in this other clearinghouse survey that we mentioned. We've written that it is focused more on urban forest, but it also encompasses basically all the forests that people visit for any kind of reason. And this wasn't presented here, but in those questions, I think you will see more tomorrow on this. People want more recreation, much more recreation than wood or anything else. And in this other survey distributed for European Landowner Association, it was something similar. So people are much more interested in this recreation, but also in these spiritual values as well. It's not just recreation, but like this self-fulfillment as well. I strongly encourage you to see this other paper as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. The next question I've got has come in from Antje Japelge to Harold, which is asking, I'm going to ask this one. Harold, did you follow any standard approach to identify the business models, or did they emerge via project research and activities?
I mean, we tried to identify, on the one hand, the different relationships between the sellers and the providers. So that was one category, whether this is now a public to private or private to public or public to public and private to private relationship. So who are somehow the actors in that context? And then also the different ways of how these mechanisms are then set in place. So whether, for instance, public entities in collaboration with private entities compensate these private owners and then pass the costs to the final consumers via taxes or via fees, or whether these are any kind of international bodies, on the other hand, that compensate national public entities, and they compensate then subnational providers. So we had a differentiation about 10, I think, in total, different business models that we considered in that context. And then we tried to see how these business relations of the actors who are interested in a certain service in the project can then be categorized in that context. And in that, we analyzed then the factors that can lead to a success in that context.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, the next question, I can see he's already there, is Davide Pettinella from UNIPD. So Davide, over to you. Sadly, we can't hear you. That's a real shame.
I can see you.
Yes, we've just heard you then. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can now. Yes.
Good. So sorry for that. So thanks for the wonderful presentation. I enjoy them, even if, of course, for some of the contents, they are pretty well known, having been able to collaborate with some of the speakers. I was wondering if among the drivers, we could also consider this extreme events that are becoming so common in Europe, that they are forcing or inducing innovation. I'm thinking, of course, to the case of forest fires and storms and bark beetle attacks. in some way that they are forcing us to use in a different way forest resources, to introduce both mechanical innovation, organizational innovation, and so on. And I think it would be worthwhile to look in the near future to the positive impacts that these extreme events may have in the overall organization of the forestry sector. Thanks.
Thanks, David. A really interesting question. Georg is desperate to answer, so Georg,
yes, this is a really great question. And yes, absolutely. I think it's a super important factor, and it's a bit like similar why we do now these virtual conferences, because we have been forced to innovate. And similar things, I think, are happening in the case of large disturbances. Just to give an example, here in the Central European, let's say the German debate, because Harald might say how the situation is in Austria or in other countries. We have seen these huge impacts of bark beetle and troughs on the most economically productive forest. And of course, if you are, then you have the timber prices are going down, and there is suddenly you're losing a lot of your standing volume that you were planning to harvest across the next years. And in response to that, forest owners, forest managers have been much more open and interested to diversify their income. And there has been a huge debate connected to restoration, connected to payment systems. How can we do this? So in that regard, a crisis creates innovation, and it would be very, very interesting to look at this in the long-term perspective, because I think these turning points in forest, in forestry, in forest income, how can it be created? There have been indeed the points for innovation. I mean, an interesting question is what's going to happen if, let's say, everything is good again on the side of forest production here in Central Europe. Let's see how this evolves. But the interplay of wood, especially wood prices, the possibilities to create income come from that. I think it has a huge impact on the side of the forest owners and forest managers to try to diversify and to innovate with new business models. Of course, on the policy side, it might be a bit different depending on the situation. Really cool question. We haven't systematically looked into it in since yet. Perhaps we should do in upcoming projects. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Georg. Harold, do you want to come in from a Nobel point of view?
Yes, I mean, just to comment on that, I also agree with Georg. It's a very important issue. I mean, just focusing now, because you mentioned about Austria, about the mountain forests. So we don't have even to look about extreme events. I mean, we just have to focus on natural hazards, trying to fulfill this protection function of the forest regarding rockfall, avalanches, mud flows. So we have learned that this summer again in Germany and many other contexts, that this kind of protection function is very important, and this is for sure a driver for innovations. In our case, I mean, we had in our Portuguese case, there was at least the idea also to include the wildfire issue, because you have mentioned fire, Davide. So in that context, natural hazard regulation was considered as one important service, and especially the landscape resistance to wildfires, considering environmental, biometric, and topological data. So that was somehow that we tried to consider in Portugal, and how the management can then try to improve this resistance on the landscape, and exploring then also the opportunity cost related to this particular management in that context. So it's just to underline very important issue. Yeah.
Thanks, Harold. Gerhard, you wanted to come in.
Yes, also I was thinking about the question by Davide, and I'm not sure in which direction Davide meant it. If he thought, Davide, if you are there, if you thought of innovations on the side of forest management, you mentioned that, and certainly climate change and those events, they are driving strongly now a change in the forest management, definitely. But when we think of does it also change something in terms of business opportunities, diversification, or payments? I'm not so sure. Probably the debate is going on, yes. But in my view, it doesn't change very much the possibilities. In Austria, for example, when it's about natural hazards, in my view, you cannot have, that can be supported with subsidies, but you cannot have a market there. It's just by the institutional setting, it's not possible to have a market. So yes, payments like subsidies or support with public money, yes, but not marketing in that sense.
Great, thanks. Great question, Davide. Okay, so the next question is coming from Algis Gajutis. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. So I'm not sure, can we get Algis on screen, or will I get his question? Okay, we'll give him against time. I'll put this question to the team. So how realistic, in your view, is the transition of forest economic services from public good to market good? And what decisions should be done for such a transition? So who would like to have a go at that one? Go, Georg.
I can always say something. Thanks for your question. I mean, it is not easy to answer, as you can see, because it really depends on the good. It also depends on the overall policy question. So if you want to be at a private good or not, and there might be cases where a society or a policy system decides that something should remain a public good. However, I think there have been great cases also in both projects, I assume, where this has been happening. Take the example of funeral forest. I think our Swiss partners also in here, that didn't exist as a business model 20 years ago, at least to my knowledge. And then suddenly someone was so creative to enable an idea, how can we use this, let's say, spiritual ecosystem services? How can I transform a small part of my forest into a, let's say, a nature funeral? And suddenly there is an idea, and suddenly also it becomes, let's say, a private good, a very special one, that you are buried in the forest, but it creates income, it transforms the forest, and also it had an impact on the institutions, because in some of the countries where this has been happening, the laws needed to, or were then changed in response to this new idea. I think this is a cool example where something that was somehow, it was perhaps, well, I leave it to the economists to discuss the details. It was already a market before, but suddenly in the forest world, someone took up an idea and developed something that was not really a vague spiritual ecosystem service, as you may say, into a business model, and with that also partly privatized it. I think this is an interesting example and case to study. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Georg. Harold, last point from you, and then we're going to
just a quick follow-up on that. I agree everything what Georg said about this legal framework and socioeconomic conditions that are very challenging and have to be considered in the particular context. And as Gerhard mentioned, for instance, like in Austria, the problems that we have in making this transition possible from a public good like this protection services to a market good. But what I personally, what my opinion is that it's also a lot about emotions. So I think it's very important that we are, as foresters, as forest managers, as forest scientists, as politicians, we are somehow learn how to create this demand. And this is all about the emotions. I mean, we learned it a lot from industry, from other markets, how to sell these services. And as long as we are not able to do that properly and professionally, I think this transition will always be somehow hampered and not successfully be implemented. But this is, I mean, my personal view about this issue.
Great, fascinating. Gosh, I mean, that conversation I think could just run and run, but I am aware of the time, and that's my job to try and keep us to time. So thanks very much. That was a good discussion. If any of the panelists want to put any other comments in, then please feel free to do it. You can answer the question on the Q&A function as well, if you want to keep that conversation going. Right, so thanks everyone. We're going to take a break now, just for a quick 10 minutes. Go and grab a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or something, and we'll be back at 5:02. With Sven Wunder about providing forest ecosystem services. So thanks very much, and I'll see you in 10 minutes.